Welcome to RUSI, everybody. I was just reflecting earlier that this room has seen so many events over the decades, almost centuries, certainly decades. And when you come into this room, it sometimes feels not only that you're going back into the past, but also that you're going into a space for camera reflection. Even as we're clearly right in the middle of a deadline set by the Prime Minister yesterday, the outcome of which is perhaps predictable, but nevertheless does create a certain degree of tension, not to speak of emotion. But we at RUSI, on security and defence issues in general, but on Brexit in particular, think that our role is to add an element of calm reflection and analysis over a set of issues which have a very technocratic analytical component, but also have a very important emotional component. And we all know, those of us who've been in the UK for the last couple of years, we know how emotional an issue Brexit was and continues to be. And we still, as a country, are deeply divided between Remainers and Leavers. And the couple of things that I've written on the topic of Brexit and security are designed to make the point, first of all, that once we leave the European Union, we will still have a very strong interest as a country in having a strong and special security partnership, as the Prime Minister has said, between the UK and the EU, but it's going to take place in a context where there are going to be some difficult issues at an emotional level as well as a technical level, which we will have to confront to ensure that the UK and the EU can continue to cooperate to their mutual advantage in a whole range of issues. And I'm going to sit down in a moment, and I guess, Nathalie, would you prefer to sit down? I think it's probably best if we both sit, but just by way of introduction. Really delighted that Nathalie is able to join us here today because of her considerable insights into European foreign and defence policy in general, but also one of the most important issues on the agenda in that regard today in Europe, a fast-moving situation. Even today, reports in the newspapers that the transition agreement is almost sewn up, even if the withdrawal agreement is not. And what my paper, and I'll go through some of the main issues with Nathalie in a moment, was designed to say is that these issues are not straightforward. There are a whole range of issues on the table. The Prime Minister's speech at the Munich Security Conference a couple of weeks ago, a number of us were present there. I think an admirable attempt to describe the problem on a whole range of issues, made it very clear, and I think the UK government from the beginning has made it very clear that this is not only an economic negotiation, it is also one with important security dimension, which is very important that we get right. So Nathalie is the director of the Institute for International Affairs in Rome. She is, I think, also a close advisor to Ms. Mogherini, the European High Representative for Foreign Policy, but she's speaking here in a personal and academic capacity, not as a representative of any European institution. So, Nathalie, perhaps I could just kick off and ask you to give your impressions as to within European institutions, but I guess within EU 27 governments more generally, the ones with whom you're aware, what's the atmosphere in relation to the security and defence aspects of Brexit? How do they think about this problem, and how far are the wider emotions around Brexit influencing that attitude?
I mean, I think to answer the question, one needs to take the step back to reflect on where we are in the European security and defence conversation more broadly. Because Brexit comes in different directions in that conversation. I mean, I think it's fair to say that...
Sorry, is this microphone working?
Is this working?
It's just record.
Okay.
So you will have to speak up then. I think.
Yeah, can everyone hear me? Okay. I tend to be loud, so it shouldn't be a problem. So, I mean, I think it's fair to say that Brexit was one of the catalyzers of where we are today. I think, and I've always been sort of convinced about this, that the Brexit was not the reason. The reason is a set of what I would consider, well, I would say there have been at the very least 3 structural factors and another 3 enabling factors. Of the enabling factors, Brexit has been one. The 3 structural factors, which to me are the most important bits of the story, have to do with the fact that we don't live on Venus. Everyone is aware of it now. This is a dangerous world, and we live in a dangerous part of the world. B, there is a growing question mark about the US security guarantee. This is unrelated to Trump. Let me say this very clearly. I think the kind of questions that Europeans are asking themselves is not in 6 months, a year, 2 or 3 years, but in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years. And we know when we're talking about defense how long it takes to actually develop certain capabilities and a certain strategic culture. It takes decades, and therefore the work needs to start now. I think that has been a second key sort of structural factor. And then there is this growing appreciation that size matters. In this complicated, multipolar, or whatever you want to call it, world that we're going to be living in, it's quite clear that only by acting on a, let's say, continental scale, including when it comes to defense, you can actually reasonably and realistically expect to project and promote your interests and values. So to me, those are the 3 big reasons why all of this is happening. But then I think it's fair to say that there have been enabling factors to this. The fact that the European Commission, for the first time in its history, wants to put money on the table when it comes to defense. It used to think of defense as being a dirty word, and now it almost too much wants to be part of the defense conversation. The fact that the Franco-German engine, for the first time in history, has started working on defense. It was interesting the way in which this came about, because it came about in the reverse order from what one would expect. You know, one would have expected France to be leading this. In fact, France only woke up post-Macron on this. It was actually very reluctant, I would say, for the best part of Hollande's last year on anything to do with EU defence. It was the Germans that, I think, for very German reasons, I think there's a broader question which is connected to the first point I was making. I mean, the fact that we live in a dangerous world, which kicked off a German conversation about defense, but Germany, being Germany, needs to frame it in a broader setting. And here there is a Trump-related factor. It's not the sexiest thing in the world to frame it in NATO terms these days. And so I think for Germany it was important to provide a European side to the story. And then there was the Brexit angle. And I think this has been incredibly important as far as perception is concerned. I mean, the broader perception, which I don't share, was that, you know, the United Kingdom was the main brake on European defence. Brake is off, or it's coming off, and therefore this sort of kicked off a new dynamic. But perceptions matter. I mean, I think concretely one can point to 2 very specific elements that probably wouldn't have happened had the UK voted Remain, and those 2 specific elements are the MPCC. Right, exactly. I was waiting for that look.
even I don't know what that is.
This is basically what Europeans have concocted in order not to say headquarter. But it is a headquarter. It's a headquarter that is initially limited only to the military missions, not to the operations, but that could eventually be expanded to the operations. This is now there. I mean, it's not fully staffed yet. And we're not talking about a big thing. We're talking about, at the moment, 30 people. If it ever will be, as I think it will be, extended to the operations, we're talking about 150, 200, I mean, nothing shaped like, but it's basically something that allows EU military missions and operations to have a linear command and control structure. So that certainly, one can look at it as an element that would not have happened with a Remain vote. And probably one could put PESCO in that category as well. So, but with those two exceptions, I would say that it's been more the major impact that Brexit has had on the beginning of the story has been this the sort of general perception that the break is off that unleashed a dynamic. But then the question is, so what now? So where are we now in terms of Brexit and European defence? But that also, again, relates to the question, where are we now on European defence? So I think, the three structural factors that I outlined, those three enabling factors that I outlined, led to the acronym SOUP, as I call it, led to the fact that we have an MPCC, a Coordinated Annual Review on Defence, a PESCO, a European Defence Fund. All these different building blocks are now in place. And now the real work starts. And the point is, what are the obstacles to that real work delivering? And how does Brexit play into them? I think there's a story about credibility here, firstly. So fine, we have lots of pieces of paper now and lots of pretty ambitious commitments. I mean, if you go through the PESCO commitments, one could say, well, actually, this is something. I don't buy the line, the commitments were diluted in order to be inclusive. If you actually compare the texts of what was known as the 4+4 letter back in July of last year with the text of the notification, yes, there's been a bit of dilution here and there, but broadly speaking, it's the same thing. The point is, with a PESCO at 26, how do you make it credible? What happens in a year and a half when 6 member states will not be in compliance with the commitments that they themselves have made? Now, you can make the argument, well, it would have been a problem anyway. But it's different if you have a PESCO at 12 and you have 1 not complying, or 2 not complying, as opposed to having a PESCO at 26 and having 7 not complying. Far more difficult to actually hold them accountable. So there's going to be a big element about that. Brexit is not a big part of that story. But I think when it comes to 2 other things, the UK is going to be critical. 2 other challenges which I see moving forward. One relates to action. So again, this whole sense of lots of pieces of paper, lots of agreements, lots of documents. Let's avoid having another list of PESCO projects. Let's just make sure that what we have agreed on actually starts happening. And there, I think, having a dose of pragmatism and therefore finding ways and means to have third-party participation in some of these projects, including the United Kingdom, is, I think, a key element. And then I think there's a third set of challenges where, again, I think that the United Kingdom heavily plays in, possibly more so than in the other, which has to do with how to push back against the, I think, what will risk being the increasingly cold winds blowing from across the Atlantic. Because here there's been, I think, a big change over the last month. Now, I don't know, and I'm hoping that it's not going to last long. So I'm hoping it's as ephemeral as other Trump things, but perhaps not. Because I think this variant of sort of US skepticism on European defence is of a different nature compared to what it was in the past. It's not simply about, our commitment to NATO and anything that could imperil that is a bad thing. I think that story is actually gone. It may be used to ignite, and this is where the United Kingdom, as well as Turkey and Norway, come in, to ignite the resistance of others beyond the United States. But I think my hunch is that the reason why the US has started changing its tune when it comes to European defence basically boils down to the same kind of convictions that there are over trade and protectionism and America first and connected to the industrial dimension to all of this. I think there are in sort of a sufficient number of EU member states, including my own, that would not want to see a protectionist interpretation of what we're doing taking place, which makes me fairly confident that it will not take that form. I mean, not because of Italy, but because it's about Italy, it's about Germany, it's about Sweden, it's about a number of other countries. So I'm fairly confident about that. But there is a risk that the reason for the US resistance is more ideological than that. And as well as a bit far-fetched, meaning, you need to have a European Defence Fund to support American industry. Well, maybe not. So, if it oversteps that mark and if it's able to sow divisions within the Union, also leveraging the role that future non-EU or current non-EU other countries can play, it will do this, or it risks doing this. So I think, we have these three sets of challenges moving forward, and the United Kingdom certainly plays in, I think, quite heavily into two of them. Which brings me to the point about, so where are we when it comes to and I read your super paper, by the way, where are we on the UK and European defence? I mean, I, like, I guess most others, have long said, this is the most promising area for in the negotiation, because unlike all other areas, the bargaining power between the two sides is far more balanced, and that in general makes for a better negotiation. There is obviously a risk of spillover from the broader negotiation, which is largely, as we know, sort of centered on the economy and everything that comes with it, sure. and this. So there is a risk of negative contamination. But I think, if the United Kingdom over the next year and a half actually continues to play a constructive role as it has, because this is the unsung story of this whole, the last couple of years, that actually have seen the United Kingdom not posing problems when it comes to these developments on European defence, and I think that's been noticed. So I think there is the scope for a win-win on this. It will be, as your paper rightly says, it will be complicated once you start getting into the details of it. And I think there will be at least three different elements of it. There's one element that has to do with the UK's participation in the Common Security and Defence Policy as we knew it, which is the story basically about missions and operations, and about participating or being involved in the planning stage, so not only in the implementation phase of an operation. I mean, let me say here that these are not new debates. I mean, there was, I think, a very lively debate that sounded back then very promising, and then in the end took a completely different turn, when the WU was shut down, and an ESDP was starting up, and there was a big debate about how to involve particularly the Turks and the Norwegians. And my sense is that if things had gone differently, particularly when it comes to the Cyprus-Turkey side of the story, those ideas were actually fairly mainstream ideas. So there's no reason, if rationality prevails, which is the million-dollar question, that those kind of ideas as to how to involve in the stages of decision shaping, which should not be brushed, sort of dusted off the shelf and taken back in. So that's one side of it. The second side, which is in many respects more complicated, and more complicated because as opposed to the CSDP story where it's a known thing, so the point is how to be imaginative about it, but it's a known thing, we know what we're talking about. When we're talking about PESCO and the fund and CARD and how all these things interact with one another, it's a moving target. And so it's far more complicated because it will be a moving target as the negotiation unfolds, which makes it on the one hand more complicated. On the other, I think it provides a very interesting opportunity, precisely because these things are going to be moving in parallel. And that could actually, again, if the EU is more open-minded about it, if the UK does not overstep its, overstep and overstretch its ambitions, is actually quite promising. There's already a debate about, third-party participation in PESCO on the fund and what have you. And it can actually then provide eventually a model also to others. And then the last thing, and then I'll shut up, the last element in all this is a broader foreign policy dialogue. How to ensure that where we are, I think is, and I think your paper very rightly pointed to this, is a moment, and the paradox of Brexit is that this is happening at a time of unprecedented convergence in terms of what the perceived interests and values are. How to ensure that that remains the case post-Brexit? And I think the only way to do it is to institutionalize that conversation and make it a regular institutionalized conversation in order to remain on that same page. Because it may well naturally be the case for 1 or 2 years. But again, what happens in 10 years from now?
Okay, I think that's really interesting. And I think it's an interesting, for us here in London, I think it's very useful to have a perspective that does focus on building EU defence as you've done, because that's very distant from the conversation we're having here, of course, where I think across the political spectrum, a lot of scepticism about what EU defence initiatives have achieved in the past, and remaining scepticism about what it may achieve in future. But I guess I'd have a slightly different emphasis on some of what you're saying. I think there's a sense here, which you didn't mention, I'd be interested in your remarks, a sense here that the UK is a pretty strong player on defence and indeed in security more generally in terms of intelligence services and what have you. And this should not be a bargaining chip, so we shouldn't be seeking to translate that into benefits in customs barriers or whatever. That would be counterproductive, I think. People toyed with that at the beginning of the process, but I think that's largely been ditched. But I think there is a sense that it means that in relation to security and defence, the UK can't be a footnote state. It can't be Norway or Switzerland or Canada even, where you can tweak the rules of how EU institutions work and bring in the UK as a third country, as it's sometimes described, which has a legal meaning and it doesn't have a pejorative meaning, but sometimes it comes across as a little bit pejorative. And I think it's also the case that given that the UK has always been sceptical about a strong EU role in defence when it's a member and has had a vote, it's a bit difficult, and maybe particularly with this government, but not only this government by any means, it's a bit difficult to conceive of a conversation which leaders here are very interested in negotiating in detail how we can get involved in PESCO or EDF or the one I hadn't heard of, NPCC or whatever it might be. It's probably more likely that I think many people who've been involved in government here will probably remember it was quite hard to get ministers when we were members to really engage with those initiatives. We did it reluctantly. There would be official pressure. We need to do this, Minister, please. If we must, really, do we really have to? Because anything with European and defence in the title, which didn't have NATO in the title, there's a sort of instinctive reaction against. And it's hard for me to imagine that reaction will be lessened when we're out. Maybe there's a counterintuitive argument is to be made that once we're out, then we can engage. But my suspicion, which I think I expressed in the paper, is that there will be a strong commitment here to maintaining strong defence and security ties with the EU. But it will be more ties between the UK on the one hand and the EU on the other, rather than trying to inveigle ourselves into the EU machinery where we'll be at a comparative disadvantage, because the way the EU is evolving, how rapidly it evolves on defence pillar, I don't know. That remains to be seen. But what is clear is that intergovernmental and commission elements are getting more intertwined. Yep. The European Defence Fund is a classic example of that, where that will be controlled by the Commission rather than by unanimity for very understandable reasons. And the High Representative, it has got both dimensions. The EU has got these two elements, and it's inherently more difficult for the UK to be involved in anything which is under ECJ jurisdiction and all the issues that are involved there. And I think a lot of interest in President Macron's European intervention initiative, which must be a rival to some extent to EU defence, although I'm sure diplomats say it's nothing of the kind. And that's something the UK is interested in, and because it's a multilateral continuation of the pretty successful UK-France defence cooperation. So I'm not sure I'm asking a question from all that. I mean, the last element, perhaps, is the referendum was not primarily about foreign and defence policy. But the EU army issue did come up in the referendum, and it is something which quite a number of strongly Brexit-supporting members of Parliament have mentioned. It continues to be part of the narrative in some EU countries, certainly not in France, which is probably the most similar country to ours in many respects. But for France, it maybe approaches it a slightly different way because of the Franco-German relation. But it's a slogan out there which very understandably, from my point of view, has a place in German politics because people want Germany to contribute to a European army, not to a German army. But it's read over here as part of a wider project of building a single federal state and so on, which I think most of us realise is not in the cards in the near term. But when people hear the sort of initial introduction you had, you yourself admitted it was about acronym soup. People say, well, this is all very well, all very interesting, totally incomprehensible. But in the end, what are Europeans going to do together to confront the latest challenge from Russia or whatever it might be? And actually, if the European countries want to send a good message to the UK over the next 3 days, then they'll, and I think they're starting to, they'll show a stronger message of solidarity to the UK than President Trump has done so far. So it's we live in very interesting times. In a way, I think as we thin the machinery of foreign policy cooperation, actions in times of crisis are going to become even more important. So that's a sort of jumble of thoughts, but I'd be interested in your response.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. But let me sort of try and respond to several of these things that you threw out there. I mean, the first is the question of what's behind the acronym soup. And if it's not a European army, what is it? And I think what is behind the acronym soup is three things. The first is, and all three stem from those three structural factors that I was mentioning. The fact that we're small, the fact that the US security guarantee is, in the long term, at the very least, a question mark, and the fact that it's a dangerous world. So you've got to do stuff. And I think those three pillars are joint, so thinking defense together, and this is the story about defense research. It's about joint capability development, and it's about joint operations. This is what the Security and Defense Union, or however you want to call it. So it's not about creating something new top-down. It's about integrating, and I use deliberately the word integrating because it's not just about cooperation. It's about systematizing that cooperation and eventually leading, indeed, to integration in these three areas. And I think this is where we're moving towards if we manage to overcome the obstacles that I was referring to. Now, in order to do all this, especially my experience over the last couple of years have really convinced me of one thing. Now, dreadful as they are, and they are dreadful, institutions matter. And institutions matter because, and this is where my skepticism on things like the European Intervention Initiative come in. Now, you can do things without the institutions, and here I'm obviously referring to EU institutions. If you're talking about bilateral cooperation, trilateral cooperation, you don't need to have a great deal of coordination. You can kind of do it on your own. But if what we're talking about is, and again I go back to those structural factors, the magnitude of the crises, of the uncertainty about someone else's protection, and about size, it's not good enough to do it bilaterally or trilaterally. You need to try and involve more Europeans as part of this exercise. And to do it, I see no other way. I mean, there's a reason why institutions are there. Because things don't naturally happen. I mean, what may naturally happen is you have a joint letter by 8 foreign ministers. That just about, you can get that done. But it doesn't go beyond a letter if you actually want to get things done. And this is where I think the difficulty also of the UK as part of this whole conversation comes in. Because I understand where the UK comes from. And I think it came out very clearly also from Theresa May's speech in Munich. You know, the UK comes from it, logically speaking, from what are our interests. I mean, we share interests, we share values, and everything flows from that. Yes, in theory. But the point is that when you're talking about the European Union, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because the point is there is no other way, institutions and rules come first. And so the trick will be that, and you know, the UK has been a member for, 4 decades, so it should know this. There is a way of getting to that, sort of putting interests and values first, but you need to know how to navigate that system. Because if you don't take those institutional mechanisms and rules and procedures seriously, then you actually end up paradoxically as a footnote. So it may sound counterintuitive, but I think you need to engage with what there is for what it is, because there's a reason why it is this way. I mean, no one, sort of, there's Robert sitting over there. I mean, no one enjoys sitting in PSC or, council meetings or in all those various committees. There is a reason why they are there, because there is no other way of bringing together something which goes beyond 2 or 3 or 4, but making it 28 and possibly more.
Let me ask you a final question, then we'll throw it up open to Q&A. With the UK no longer being at the table in the Foreign Affairs Council and PSC and so on, how will that affect the culture and the orientation of European foreign policy? Because after all, as the Prime Minister said in Munich, the UK will be taking back control. We will have a national foreign policy, an independent foreign policy, according to her, in a year from now. But that's also the case for the EU. The EU will be free to come to orientations, which will be influenced, I guess, more by its bigger states than its smaller states, but through the institutional mechanism you just mentioned, without the EU being in the room. And even if there's some sort of observer light status, we will have much less influence. So when new crises emerge, and some people will put forward the thesis that an EU foreign policy without the UK will be less globally oriented, more neighbourhood oriented, because a number of major countries in it which have a more global perspective will be reduced. And one of the perhaps the 2 leading countries with more of a global perspective, there will now only be one. So, I mean, is that right? It would be surprising, wouldn't it, if the EU had a foreign policy without the UK, which was exactly the same as it had with it?
I'm actually less sceptical, I guess, than you on this point, and I say this because if I think at the various issues, I mean, okay, so setting aside this defence sort of conversation, but if you think about Middle East and Russia and China and I mean the big dossiers, with the exception of Russia. And actually, I think that there is a Russia problem, potential problem moving forward. But with the exception, and I'll come back to this, with the exception of Russia, I can't think of anything on which the United Kingdom was very clearly on one extreme of the spectrum. And therefore being heavy, having a certain weight and being on one extreme, it kind of pulled over the consensus towards that side. I think on most issues, the UK is actually bang in the middle. So in terms of positions, I don't see a major change, with the exception of Russia. And the reason why I say with the exception of Russia is that one of the things that I hadn't appreciated until I started the work on the global strategy for the HRVP a few years ago was that the UK is very much on one end, much more so, than countries that you would typically associate to that end, the Baltic countries and Poland and what have you. On some issues, it was the UK that was one step beyond. So following the logic of, consensus building, I could imagine that Russia would indeed be one of those issues in which the tune may start changing in a couple of years. Also because this will connect with a number of other things, beginning with developments in Italy, just to name one.
I won't try to ask you to predict, by the way.
No, but I will say one thing on this, which was actually very disturbing in many respects. So as IAI, we organised, 10 days before the election, sort of meeting on, foreign policy and the electoral campaign, and we had representatives of all parties. And I asked them a sort of straight yes/no question, and amongst others, and it was, if there is no movement at all on Russia when it comes, on Ukraine when it comes to implementation of Minsk and what have you, would you agree to lifting sanctions now? All of them said yes.
All the parties?
All of the parties.
Even PD?
Yeah. Anyway, so with the exception of that Russia point, I don't see any major changes in terms of positions. But then on the question of how global and how neighbourhood, there also I don't see a massive change, because when it comes to the non-security and defence bit, I think already the EU is increasingly global. To me, if you think about the legacy of this particular commission, there'll be the defence bit, that's clear. Trade. I think trade is one of the big success stories of this particular commission, and that has a very global agenda. So I think on the non-security and defence bit, that you will continue to be very globally minded, and on the security and defence bit, it never was. It's not as if with the UK we were active in the South China Sea. We were not, and we will not be at that level.
Very good. Excellent. Right, we've got a number of questions, so maybe I'll take a couple and then we'll come back. My colleague in the front row.